Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to continue the discussion of the chapters of human devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. This will be a discussion of the text, its impact at the time, and current relevance. So, in our first meeting, we talked about the introduction to the book, which was meant to be comprehensive because we anticipated that there might be reporters and others who would be interested in the book, but not have time to immediately read it. So by reading the introduction, you can get a good overview of the book. Chapter 1 was Ascended Apes or Fallen Angels. And I decided to introduce the topic in that way because that is the terms that were used to frame the issue in the 19th century when the evolutionary ideas of Charles Darwin started to infiltrate the intellectual space of the world. And Ascended Apes is a reference to the Darwinian theory of human evolution. It calls forth a materialistic picture, whereas fallen angels, which isn't a Vedic term, but a term that was used by those who were taking a different view, it has a more spiritual aspect. And that was deliberate in the sense that human devolution is going to take us beyond the world of matter into the world of consciousness or spirit, and the idea that we're part of a whole cosmic hierarchy of beings, which is pretty far from where people are today. So today we're going to look at chapters 2, 3, and 4 of Human Devolution. And the subtitle of the book is A Vedic Alternative to Darwin's Theory. But the question may be raised, why offer an alternative if one isn't called for? So these chapters 2, 3, and 4 were meant to present evidence that suggests an alternative is needed, or at least there is space in which to offer an alternative. There are unexplained elements which an alternative might be able to account for. So there are 3 categories of such evidence that I dealt with in the book.
You have a moment just to tell me that guy's name. I need.
I'm hearing someone. Okay. All right. So I'll continue. One category of evidence I deal with is the evidence that Richard Thompson, Sadhguru Prabhu, and I presented in Forbidden Archaeology. Evidence showing that there is reason to question the Darwinian theory of human evolution specifically. Then in chapter 3, I talk about evidence for non-human species that contradicts the current understandings. And in chapter 4, we look at genetic evidence. So first, we're going to look at the Forbidden Archaeology chapter, which is a summary of the evidence presented in the book of that title. Now, the Vedic element here, because we say we're offering a Vedic alternative, the Vedic element is that the historical writings of the Vedic tradition, the Puranas, like the Bhagavad Purana or Srimad Bhagavatam, contain accounts of a very ancient human presence on this earth, going back much further in time than the currently dominant ideas allow. The currently dominant ideas propose that humans like us first appeared on this planet between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. Now, when I say Vedic, I mean my understanding of the principal Vedic texts, in this case, the Puranas, my understanding of them as I've received them through the tradition that I've attached myself to, and especially in terms of their presentation by my teacher, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Now, I fully accept that this is my individual approach, and others within the tradition and even within the followers of my own teacher may have different opinions. But I'm presenting what I put out in the book Forbidden Archaeology. My methodology was to make a prediction based on the Puranas. If the Puranic accounts of extreme human antiquity are true, there should be reports of archaeological evidence for humans existing millions of years ago. You'll note I didn't say archaeological evidence. I said reports of archaeological evidence. My methodology for testing this prediction were to examine all archaeological reports from the time of Darwin to the present, or as many as I could actually locate. And the findings I had were basically two. There are no reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity going back millions and millions of years in the current secondary literature, like textbooks. But second conclusion is a little more interesting. There are many reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity in the primary scientific literature, past and present. By primary literature, I mean reports published by professional archaeologists, geologists, and others digging into the earth in their peer-reviewed scientific publications. So we collected those reports and analyzed them in this book, of which this chapter in Human Devolution is a summary. The question arose, if this evidence is reported in the primary scientific literature in the form of reports of evidence of human bones, human footprints, and human artifacts going very far back in time, then why isn't it in today's secondary literature, textbooks? And we concluded it was because of a process of knowledge filtration. And the filter is the dominant consensus in the scientific discipline, which is sometimes called a paradigm. That term was popularized by philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He said there, in the absence of a paradigm, all of the facts that could possibly pertain to the development of a given science are likely to seem equally relevant. But when there is a paradigm, in other words, when there is a general consensus that emerges about the methodology and conclusions that can best be drawn from the available evidence, when such a paradigm does emerge, there is some basis for judging the relevance of evidence. And the way that what Thomas Kuhn called normal science operates is that evidence or reports of evidence that conform to the paradigm pass through this intellectual filter very easily, whereas anomalous evidence, evidence that contradicts the paradigm, doesn't fit easily within it, is filtered out, by which we mean set aside, perhaps dismiss summarily on flimsy grounds, or in some cases, some few cases, actively suppressed. Kuhn noted, quote, and normal science often suppresses fundamental novelties because they are subversive of its basic commitments. But anomaly can also have a positive aspect. Kuhn noted, discovery commences with the awareness of anomaly, that is, with the recognition that nature has somehow violated the paradigm-induced expectations that govern normal science. So in that sense, forbidden archaeology can be seen as a presentation of anomalies that don't fit within the present paradigm. And this was recognized by some of the scholars who reviewed the book when it first came out. For example, this scholar wrote, Cremo and Thompson have written a provocative work that raises the problem of the influence of the dominant ideas of a time period on scientific research. These ideas can compel the researchers to orient their analyses according to the conceptions that are permitted by the scientific community. And I'll just give one or two representative examples from this chapter, which are taken from the original book. The California gold mine discoveries is one example. During the 19th century, gold was discovered in central California in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and miners went there to extract the gold. And in so doing, they dug tunnels into the sides of mountains like Table Mountain in Tuolumne County, California. Deep inside the mine tunnels and solid rock, the miners found human artifacts. For example, they found many stone mortars and pestles. And these were found in layers of rock that modern geologists tell us belong to the early part of the Eocene period, which means they would be about 50 million years old. These discoveries were reported to the scientific world by Dr. J.D. Whitney, a Harvard-educated geologist who became the chief government geologist of the state of California. His report was published in 1880 by the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. But we don't hear very much about these discoveries today because of the paradigm-induced process of knowledge filtration This is the anthropologist William Holmes of the Smithsonian Institution. He said, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of evolution as we understand it today, then he would have hesitated to come to those conclusions. In other words, he should have known that the evidence couldn't possibly be true because it didn't fit the emerging picture of human evolution that was coming into dominance at the time. So Kuhn cited an experiment in psychology that helps understand this phenomenon. In this experiment, the psychologists altered some cards in a standard deck of cards. On the top row, for example, you see the 6 of spades, which should be black, but in this case, it's red. So in this experiment, what the psychologists did is they would take a subject and they would show the subject one card after another in the deck. And the subject had to identify what the card was. So they would see and identify each card. So they'd go through the deck and they'd come to, for example, the red 6 of spades. They show it to the person, he identify it as 6 of hearts, perhaps. Almost no one noticed what was really there in front of them. They didn't know it was an anomaly. They just saw it as they were accustomed to see it. So Kuhn said, in science, as in the playing card experiment, novelty emerges only with difficulty manifested by resistance against a background provided by expectation. And that's what we claimed was going on in some of these knowledge filtering incidents. And this kind of stands up to what's happening currently. I'll give an example. In 2015, archaeologists published a report about a finger bone that was found at a site in Tanzania at Olduvai Gorge in a formation 1.84 million years old. The scientists carefully studied this finger bone, which was a left fifth proximal manual phalanx circled there, and they carefully measured it, dozens of different measurements, and then using computer programs, they compared the measurements of this finger bone to the same finger bone in chimpanzees, gorillas, macaques, baboons, anatomically modern humans, and a sample of fossil hominin finger bones that are the same one. And what they found is that this newly discovered bone, which was labeled Olduvai hominid 86, OH 86, fit squarely in the modern human group and was different from that of any type of previous hominin ancestor like Australopithecus or Homo habilis. And it was different from any species of ape or monkey as well. So they said it fit in the modern human group. But their conclusion was OH86 represents a hominin species whose closest form affinities are to modern Homo sapiens. However, the geological age of OH86 obviously precludes its assignment to Homo sapiens. In other words, it's too old for Homo sapiens. It couldn't be. So this is a case where scientists may be looking at evidence and it's and instead of reporting what they actually see and observe, they explain it in a way that it doesn't violate the paradigm. It's human, but it can't be human because it's too old. I think the possibility, well, just to mention what Kuhn says about incidents like this, no part of the aim of normal science is to call forth new sorts of phenomena. Indeed, those that will not fit the box are often not seen at all. So I think the possibility should be considered that OH86 could be assigned to Homo sapiens and be given an age of 1.84 million years. So that is the point that from Forbidden Archaeology that is in chapter 1 of Human Devolution. How those points were accepted by the original academic reviewers of Forbidden Archaeology, which was reviewed in most of the major scientific publications that deal with human origins, is interesting. For example, in the British Journal for History of Science, archaeologist Tim Murray wrote that Forbidden Archaeology, quote, provides the historian of archaeology with a useful compendium of case studies in the history and sociology of scientific knowledge, which can be used to foster debate within archaeology about how to describe the epistemology of one's discipline. He further continued, Forbidden Archaeology is designed to demolish the case for biological and cultural evolution and to advance the cause of a Vedic alternative. So this was one of the objectives in publishing Forbidden Archaeology and later Human Devolution, is to introduce into the current discourse of archaeology and anthropology the idea that there is a Vedic alternative. And it's the subtitle of Human Devolution is inspired by this recognition by this author here. Now, when I'm quoting him, I'm not implying that he endorses the Vedic alternative or forbidden archaeology. That's not my purpose, but there are some things he said that are relevant to the point I'm trying to make here. But what he said about the dominant paradigm is interesting. He said, the dominant paradigm has changed and is changing in archaeology, and practitioners openly debate issues which go right to the conceptual core of the discipline. Whether the Vedas have a role to play in this is up to the individual scientist concerned. And I think that's a very enlightened attitude. Obviously, today, the Vedic point of view is not dominant in the world of science or scholarship generally. But that doesn't mean it should be excluded. If there's anyone who wishes to present it, they should be able to do it. And whether or not to accept that the Vedas have a role to play. It's up to the individual scientists concerned. I agree with them. In their review of forbidden archaeology, these historians of science asked the question: has forbidden archaeology made any contribution to the literature on paleoanthropology? Our answer is a guarded yes, they said, for two reasons. First, much of the historical material they, Cremo and Thompson, resurrect has not been scrutinized in such detail before. Second, Cremo and Thompson do raise a central problematic regarding the lack of certainty in scientific truth claims. Now, I thought that was very interesting coming from two prominent historians of science who specialize in archaeology, the history of archaeology. It was quite interesting for them to say these reports have not been scrutinized in such detail before. And second, raising an epistemological question about the nature of scientific truth claims. So as far as current relevance and future prospects in this particular area are concerned, I think a lot depends upon how one understands the discipline of archaeology as it relates to this question of human origins. Of course, archaeology has many other concerns aside from human origins, but basically, when I've looked at the discipline of archaeology, I see two basic groups. One is what I call the archaeology group, archaeology singular. And that group accepts one objective, empirical, professional archaeology united in presenting its best supported narratives through reliably chosen mediators to the public who should accept them as the archaeologists intended them to be accepted. That's one group. But there's another group or groups, which I call the archaeologies group. And they're prepared to accept multiple archaeologies. The Journal of the World Archaeological Congress, which is the world's largest international organization of professional archaeologists, it's titled Archaeologies. And in their editorial note explaining the purpose of the journal, they say they want diversity of views represented in it. They want multivocality. They want indigenous and post-colonial approaches to archaeology. And they stress that they're open to the importance of non-Western epistemologies. In other words, they're open to considering, say, an Australian Aboriginal archaeology or a Pacific Islander archaeology or a Native American Indian archaeology or perhaps a Vedic archaeology. So I've found archaeologists who are in this archaeologies plural group open to the kinds of presentations that I give. But I'd like to point out that my work, human devolution, in this case, is not scripture. It was the product of a particular time and place. The book was published, I think, in 2005 originally. And I regard my work at that time as exploratory and experimental. And it should be taken like that. As far as the future prospects go, I think it depends upon whether or not one is dealing with the archaeologies group or the archaeology group. To make progress with the archaeology group would require one to be a properly credentialed archaeologist and work within the paradigm to expand its understanding of the extent of human antiquity, which would mean documenting cases that are relatively close to what's currently accepted. I will point out in the years that have passed since Forbidden Archaeology was published, the scientific understanding of how old the human species is has gone progressively further and further back in time. In the 1990s, when Forbidden Archaeology was published, it was about 100,000 years. In the next decade, it was about 200,000 years. Now, in the present day, they're up to about 300,000 years. So they're heading in the right direction, but taking very small steps, I would say. So question arises, all right, so you have some evidence that questions the current timeline for the origin of the human species. What about other species? So that's the subject matter of chapter 3. And chapter 3 is mostly about one case. And I have to admit, at that time, we had been focusing on human origins, not the origin of all species. We had chosen the human species because some in the world of science have claimed that the fossil record for human origins is the best case among all the species that they have for the Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection. So therefore we had focused on that. But there's an interesting case from the Salt Range Mountains in Pakistan, and that is the substance of chapter 3. It's based on a paper I presented at the 21st International Congress for History of Science held in Mexico City. And it was called Paleobotanical Anomalies Bearing on the Age of the Salt Range Formation, Historical Survey of an Unresolved Scientific Controversy. I got a National Science Foundation grant to attend that conference. It's probably the only time in history that the NSF has funded anti-evolutionary research. So these discoveries at this salt mine in the Cura Gorge in the Salt Range Mountains was reported to the scientific world by the Indian paleobotanist Birbal Sahni in the 1940s. He found fossils of flowering plants and insects in the early Cambrian formations in this place, which is now in Pakistan. At that time, it was part of India. Now, the significance of that is, according to the dominant paradigm in botany, paleobotany, the very first land plants, which weren't of the flower-bearing type, they're gymnosperms, like things like that. Um, they first appeared a little more than 400 million years ago. And the first flowering plants, which include all the fruits and vegetables and grains and things like that that we generally use for food, the first flowering plants appeared uh, less less than 150 million years ago, maybe sometime around that period. In other words, hundreds of millions of years later. So sometimes I get into interesting discussions. This is a discussion I got into with an evolutionary biologist at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, biggest university in Brazil. I had given a talk on forbidden archaeology and human devolution, and he had mentioned this problem. Like he said, okay, you've given some evidence that contradicts the current theories of human origins, but what about all the other species? And he particularly asked me, what about evidence for big dogs existing at the time of the dinosaurs? And this is a discovery that came to my attention after Human Devolution was written. But I had mentioned to this gentleman that I'm glad you asked that question. Sometimes in my talks, after I end them, the PowerPoint is officially ended, I have some extra slides anticipating certain questions. And I had showed him, well, it's interesting that you asked about big dogs in the Cretaceous period, because some interesting discoveries have recently been made by paleontologists in China. They found the fossil bones of a large mammal. We have to understand that the standard idea was that most of the mammals that existed during the Mesozoic, the time of the dinosaurs, were small, about the size of a mouse, something like that. So to have this huge carnivorous wolf-like or dog-like mammal, which had the bones of a baby dinosaur in its stomach area, was really kind of revolutionary. This new evidence gives us a drastically new picture, said the original discoverer in Nature. So I would say that this is an area that needs a lot more research, especially on the basis of discoveries that have been made in China by paleontologists. There are many anomalous discoveries of mammals that have been found to be existing long before they appear in what's seen as the consensus view. So I would say if we have any paleontologists who are interested in these things, this would be an area that really needs to be developed. And finally, chapter 4, genes, design, and designer. Basically, in this chapter 4, we look at a lot of topics, but they come under I looked at a lot of topics, but they come under the headings of the origin of life, the development of body plans and structures, and the place and time of human origins. First, the question of human origins. Basically, the whole Darwinian picture of evolution, which includes human evolution, depends on the idea that if you trace the history of life back, back, back in time, eventually you come to a point a couple billion years ago where there is no life on Earth. There's only chemicals floating in the ocean or other bodies of water. And somehow or other, they say those molecules, those chemical elements, self-organized to become some first reproducing single-celled organism. So they say that, they assert it as a fact, but there's no demonstration of it. So even today, I mean, I said this in Human Devolution, which goes back 20 or more years, 30 years maybe, that there was no explanation for the origin of life, and that's still true today. And for example, these researchers point out, and you can find dozens of quotes like this throughout the literature, when, where, and how did life on Earth originate? These questions on the origin of life are among the biggest unsolved problems in natural science. So that conclusion has stood up pretty well. Then there's the origin of different animal body plans. I mean, what to speak of plant body plans? I mean, you have simple grasses, simple bacteria, huge pine trees, flowering trees. There are so many different types of body plans for different plant species, but this is focusing just on the body plans for animals. There's a big variety of them. And how they originated, I said, in Human Devolution is not understood. That is still true at the present moment, as these quotes reveal. Foremost among the unresolved problems confronting modern biology is the origin of biological complexity, most notably of the shape and form of our bodies. And another one of the same, there could be dozens of them up there. So that conclusion of human devolution is still there, viable. Then there's the question of the use of genetic evidence to learn something about when and where our human species originated. And basically how this works is, and this is explained in chapter 4 in Human Devolution in great detail, is scientists can either look at DNA in existing populations of humans, or more recently, ancient DNA. So most of the work on human origins and antiquity has been done by examining variations in the DNA of living populations of humans. And basically what they tried to do is use different computer algorithms and programs to sort out the evidence and find what they call the most recent common ancestor. In other words, the diversity can be mapped in that way. And when they find that most recent common ancestor, using certain assumptions about the rates of mutation in DNA, in genes and DNA, they claim to be able to calculate the time. And by studying the present distribution of the genomes of people, they think they can isolate the place where this most recent common ancestor of living humans existed. But one big problem with this methodology is there may have been humans existing before the most recent common ancestor. And also the present locations of existing populations with the kind of genome that they're looking for the most recent common ancestor may not have been the same location. So these weaknesses of this type of evidence, which were pointed out in Forbidden Archaeology and in Chapter 4 of Human Devolution, are still operative today. Now, more recently, scientists have developed the ability to recover and reconstruct genomic material from fossils, from human fossils, going back to, say, the time of the Neanderthals, about 100,000, 150,000 years ago, maximum. But that is itself up to scrutiny, and that is something that has to be developed. In human devolution, I was strictly dealing with, as was the case at the time, with genomic evidence from living populations being extrapolated into the past by different methods. But if I were trying to do the same thing today, it would definitely take into account the phenomenon of ancient DNA, which is becoming more and more prominent in archaeological research today, although it remains controversial. So some of the reaction to this kind of evidence came in reviews of human devolution shortly after it was published. This is Jeffrey Schwartz he's got 2 appointments at University of Pittsburgh, one in anthropology and the other in history and philosophy of science. He wrote, he got something covering. He wrote about chapter 4 in Human Devolution. Cremo takes on biology, biochemistry, and genetics to further his argument that Darwinian evolution fails to account for discrepancies in the evidence. Here, Cremo relies particularly heavily on scientific creationist literature to back up his claims. Now, I'll ask you to guess what the next sentence is. I thought it was going to be, and therefore nothing he says should be taken seriously. But it's interesting what he did say. So interestingly, both his criticisms and those of scientific creationists, especially of so-called molecular systematics, are actually worth paying attention to. In other words, I had cited, along with my criticism, that of representatives of the intelligent design concept, such as Michael Behe. And he said both his criticisms and those of scientific creationists are worth paying attention to. For if one is not blinded by the technology of DNA sequencing, or by the notion that for metazoans, in other words, multicellular creatures, DNA is the blueprint of life, then the untested assumptions underlying assertions of relatedness, times of emergence, etc., that derive from the imposition of Darwinian thinking on genetic or molecular data become remarkably clear. So I thought that was good. He also wrote, the attack by Cremo on evolution is an attack on Darwinism, but in many ways, this is not hard to understand. Even Darwin's contemporaries had difficulty embracing his model of slow, gradual, accumulative change. Consequently, why should it be surprising to find smart but not evolutionary minded folk such as Cremo having a go at debunking Darwinism? So those are the chapters from Human Devolution that I included in the beginning of the book to offer some reasons why I considered there was some space open for consideration of a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. And next time, we're going to start presenting an alternative, but it'll begin with a case from the history of science. Alfred R. Wallace, who was, along with Darwin, the co-founder of the theory of evolution by natural selection, went beyond the kind of stones and bones that we talked about in forbidden archaeology. So it's a fascinating story. He thought we're part of a whole cosmic hierarchy of beings, and that there is more to a human being than just the chemical elements. There are subtle mental energies and even a soul. So, and then we'll also go over chapter 6, which gives an introduction to the modern scientific evidence that shows what a human being really is, that there's not just matter to be considered, but matter, mind, and consciousness. Because before we even ask the question, where do human beings come from, we should first of all ask the question, what is a human being? What is it we're trying to explain? And so that'll be next time. And I'll just end with a brief, as I did last time, I gave an example of my experiences at the time and representing this to the general public in different countries. This was a tour I did of Bulgaria, where the book was translated into Bulgarian. So I went there on a lecture tour. This was at the Department of Anthropology of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. They invited me there to make a presentation, and I spoke with the director and some of the staff. This was a meeting with scientists at a scientific association in Plovdiv in Bulgaria. That was the audience. Lots of discussion and questions afterward. This is the University of Sofia in Bulgaria. There was the audience and some of the books in Bulgarian language. Lots of discussion followed. Many discussions with students. The American University. I got there and I wondered, is anybody going to show up for the talk? Fortunately, some people did come. This was at a high school for advanced students, just at a public library. And I was on Bulgarian national television, had signed numerous books at an international book fair. People would bring artifacts for me to look at. It's on national radio and television, coverage in newspapers, book bookstore events all over the country. As I said, this was an experimental effort on my part, just to see what the reaction to a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory being presented, would it have any impact in the academic world among the general public? I was very curious, and it seemed to me that there are possibilities for introducing these ideas to different audiences in a way that can generate interest among different segments of society. Now, how that will be done now and in the future may be quite different than the way I attempted to do it, but I see many hopeful signs of that. Here are some of my books. Contact information, and a special offer from my website where 5 of my books are available at a special low price. Hidden History of the Human Race, which is the abridged version of Forbidden Archaeology. Forbidden Archaeology's Impact, which documents the academic responses to the book. Human Devolution, which we're talking about today, and a couple of others as well. So thank you for your attention.
Hey, thank you very much. It was extremely interesting. Are there any questions or concerns from those of you that are listening? You can unmute yourself or put a question into the chat. I have just a question. The term that you used when describing the DNA analysis, was that ancient DNA? Is that what you said?
Yes,
Okay.
that's how it's referred to. That means DNA evidence, not from a living human, but from the bones of a fossil human or hominid ancestor of anatomically modern humans. DNA has been recovered from Neanderthal specimens. And, for example, many populations living today have DNA from Neanderthals, common with Neanderthals. So it's within the past 10 years that it's become very influential in archaeology. And many archaeologists are questioning it in this sense, in a disciplinary sense, that they say, I trained to become an archaeologist, to excavate fossils, to excavate artifacts. And now it seems that the archaeology isn't necessary anymore. You're just collecting specimens for people who study molecular biology and genetics. In other words, our discipline is being kind of hijacked in a sense. So there is that kind of mentality among some of the archaeologists. But yeah, ancient DNA, that's what it's known as in the literature of the disciplines that are concerned with that. And as I said, it's becoming, as they've developed better techniques for recovering the DNA and reconstructing it, because it's an organic molecule, and over time in fossils it gets broken. The molecular structure gets broken up. But as I said, they develop techniques where they can reproduce it and reconstruct it.
Wow. Okay, thank you. I'm actually along those same lines. I had or have a very simplistic idea of archaeology now. So because it seems that, well, just a very simple question, have they dug up everything that is to be dug up? It almost seems like, are they going to keep finding new things? Like the picture you showed about this human finger was very recent, less than 10 years ago. And so what is archaeology like now? I know you just mentioned the advances in technology that can test things, but are there still discoveries being made of artifacts, of other kinds of tangible evidence that then can then be tested?
Yes, I mean, if you go to a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress or European Association of Archaeologists or another society, either virtually or in person, you can find many discoveries. I mean, I'm talking about not discoveries, I'm talking about just reports of discoveries that have been made by others. But there are thousands of professional archaeologists who are uncovering artifacts and human bones, and in some cases, bones of human ancestors. And that one reason for that is that most countries over the past 30 or 40 years have passed laws that require archaeological investigation of sites that are uncovered in the course of building roads or dams or housing developments. By law, they have to bring in archaeologists if they encounter anything, evidence of a settlement, evidence of human bones or anything. And the company that's doing it has to pay for it. You know,
Wow.
so actually, it there's a lot of discovery that goes on that we don't even have very easy access to because it's not necessarily published in the scientific literature. It goes into the archives of different government agencies. So, yeah, a lot of discoveries continue to be made. Now, a lot of it, see, there are different types of archaeology. You know, there's archaeologists who focus on what they call classical archaeology, you know, evidence related to ancient civilizations of Rome, Greece, the Middle East, and things like that. Then there are those who engage in prehistoric archaeology, archaeology that goes beyond the time of what they consider to be uh, the historical written record. And yeah, there are archaeologists that concentrate on different periods of time, the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, concentrate on different geographical areas. So yeah, there's a tremendous amount of discovery that goes on. And another thing that I've noticed is that they're kind of into doing things in big groups and using big data sets, you know, looking for connections between thousands or even millions of artifacts at different sites, you know, trying to correlate them. And it's called big data.
Oh,
So,
thank you. Thank you very much for that explanation.
I have a question, Brahmatir. They're great, Karma. Really, really good. Are you still cataloging forbidden archaeology type anomalies?
yes, and soon, relatively soon, hopefully by the end of the year, there will be a book coming out. It's called Extreme Human Antiquity. It's in the process of being typeset now. And, you know, after it's typeset, then it goes out for printing and then into the distribution channels. Hopefully it'll be out by the end of the year. Yeah, so I am continuing to gather cases and publish them in due course of time.
Very good, very good.
We have a question, Lori. Oh, it's Lavanya. Yes, go ahead. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, I mean, yeah, I was just gonna ask if in the course of the research for human devolution, what kind of, changed your paradigms and what were the most amazing discoveries you made in that process of creating the book?
Well, what I found interesting was the history of research into the paranormal that went on in the world of Western science. And it's a part of the history that's sort of been subjected to this knowledge filtering process. And basically, I'll be dealing with that in coming episodes of this series of talks when we get into the topics related to mind and consciousness. Basically, the evidence that contradicts the dominant theories that we've been considering today is related to either the stones and bones of archaeology or the chemical elements that make up the genome. But when we get into the next chapters of human devolution, we're going to be dealing with evidence that there's more to a human being than a complex machinery, complex chemical machinery. You know, there is a subtle mind element with some very unusual powers. There is a conscious self that can exist apart from the material body and material mind. And it's in those areas that I found the most interesting things for me. For example, I learned that Pierre and Marie Curie, who are kind of like saints of modern science, particularly Marie Curie, she got a Nobel Prize in physics for her work in discovering radium. And her husband, Pierre Curie, also got a Nobel Prize for his work in physics. So they're very prominent people in the history of science. But what I never found mentioned was that they were into psychical research. They were doing research into mediums who had paranormal powers like psychokinesis, mind over matter, the ability to mentally influence matter in ways that aren't explainable by the current dominant ideas in physics. So to find those types of evidence was really eye-opening for me. It's also the case with Wallace, Alfred Russel Wallace, whom we're going to talk about in the next meeting. As I said, he was, along with Darwin, the co-founder of the theory of evolution by natural selection. And that's in all the textbooks. But, you know, originally the theory of evolution was called the Wallace-Darwin theory, but his name got dropped out later because he became interested in these other phenomenons that are now put in the category of paranormal. For him, they were normal because he was observing them. He was observing these kinds of effects. And he gradually got sidelined and marginalized in the scientific and academic world, although he's still recognized for his contributions to evolution by natural selection. His later work is completely ignored or it's dismissed on very flimsy grounds. So to me, those kinds of revelations were interesting to me and exciting to me because they kind of offered a bridge between people who might think, well, we're Western science, people from India, they belong to some other entirely different realm. They may have their mythology and folk ideas, but here in the West, we're pretty strict materialists and always have been. Not so if you look into the actual history of science.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to chapters 5 and 6 for next time. We'll be here in 2 weeks. Yeah, thank you very much. Reach out to us if you have any questions or any concerns or would like to purchase a book. Also the information for purchasing the book sets is here. It's on the screen. Thank you again for your time, for taking the time to explain this. It's so different to hear you going through these, rather than just reading it on your own. So it's much appreciated. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. Everyone, hope you have a good rest of your weekend. And we'll see you then.